Right. So, as was said, there's probably a lot of parallels between the previous presentation and this one. You'll see a discussion of how science is being communicated more broadly and unknowns as well, but we'll get to that on time. I've entitled this presentation CO2 Storage, Knowledge Infrastructures, Seismic Monitoring, and the Sleipner Project. The Sleipner Project is a CO2 storage project offshore in the Norwegian North Sea. There to the left you see an image of the rig pumping natural gas out, as you can see on the right side, from the Sleipner West field, separating CO2 from it and pumping it back into another layer in the geology. That's been taking place since 1996. And Sleipner has sort of a legacy of being known as a uniquely successful CO2 storage project in CCS circles. Here's a very alluring image by Statoil showing the sexiness of CCS, I think. You have on the top layer natural gas being pumped out up into the Sleipner platform. Separation taking place, and then CO2 being pumped back into a lower strata. That is being done with this notion that this ground might say in mind that the CO2 will be stored permanently. This is an image from the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change's special report on CCS from 2005. It's some years old now, but I use the image because it's been tremendously important, I think, in structuring beliefs about the permanence of the stored CO2 and its evolution over time. You have from here on this graph 4 trapping mechanisms in the very short term. You have the structural and stratigraphic trapping that's mediated by the geology itself. Over time, some of the CO2, because it's buoyant, will migrate towards the surface, so you have residual trapping. Some of them will be dissolved in the brine within the geology, within the sandstone where it's pumped in. That leads to solubility trapping of small elements, and over very, very long periods of time, thousands of years, the CO2 interacts with the surrounding geology, so you lead to new mineral formations and essentially a form of mineral trapping in solids. Right, let me just try and follow here. You can't have notes explained on the Windows version. Why have I looked at this? This was a part of my PhD where I looked at the transfer of knowledge from scientific circles, specifically geoscientific circles, into policy and regulatory language, and how it created a foundation for beliefs, in this case about CO2 storage and permanence and security. And here are some examples of some reports that have quoted Sleipner research as pretty solid evidence that you can do CO2 storage in a safe and secure manner, and that the CO2 will remain stored permanently. If I read the quote where the technology for such storage of CO2 is considered proven by the CO2 storage of the Sleipner field in the North Sea. That I took from a scientific paper discussing the Snøhvit CCS project and another Norwegian attempt at CO2 separation and storage. And there's a quote down there from an EU parliamentary discussion in 2008 that laid the foundation for what was known as the CCS Directive, which was published a year later, regulating CO2 storage within the EU region. So the question I'm primarily addressing with this is how have beliefs, outputs, and research processes been conditioned by common practices, specifically looking at the geoscientific community that studies CO2 storage. And I look at, so I just want to point out 3 elements of theory that, three elements of theory that I thought were useful at addressing this. The first is the idea of knowledge infrastructures, and I take this quote from Paul Edwards' book, A Vast Machine, in which he looks at climate modeling and the evolution of the climate modeling community over the past several decades. And Paul Edwards defines it as knowledge infrastructures comprise robust networks of people, artifacts, and institutions that generate, share, and maintain specific knowledge about the human and natural worlds. Secondly, because I've looked at this within a scientific community that is trying to address new issues by assembling lots of old or pre-existing analytical tools. I draw on Nancy Cartwright's philosophy of science, which she founds on in the Dappled World, and her writings since then. She says, often we must combine both knowledge and technical know-how from a large number of different fields to produce a model that will agree well enough on the matter we are looking to predict the method of the combination justified at best very locally. And thirdly, Brian Wynn's notion of ignorance from his probably famous paper at this point, Uncertainty in Environmental Learning from 1992, in which he defines 4 categories of risk and uncertainty, there's being risk, uncertainty, determinacy, and ignorance. I refer to all of these in the final write-up that I do, but it's just important here to point out his definition of ignorance. Thus, ignorance is endemic to scientific knowledge, which has to reduce the framework of the known to that which is amenable to its own parochial methods and models. And I'm hoping it will become clear how to use these when we look at the Sleipner publication network. So there's a very defined network of geoscientists who have been sort of had privileged access to data from the Sleipner project over the years. And this is just from a very limited search that I did. I tried to restrict it as much as I possibly could and come up with something we could call a set of core set citations. Again, if you're interested in methodology of how I did this, we can get onto that another point. We can talk about it. But suffice it to say that since 2003 to 2011, yes, there have been more publications, obviously, but the citations up from related to the Sleipner project have risen markedly, and they've been quoted by people who don't necessarily work within the Sleipner project, but they're interested in CCS and CO2 storage. Here's an image of this, the core set that I just had on the graph before. You have 24 publications in this very, very restricted search. This was generated with a piece of social network analysis software called CINet. If you're interested, you want to talk to me later about what this is, if you've never used it. It looks pretty cool, I think. That's not the only reason I used it. It's a really good illustration of who's important in the network and how communication is spread. So in this case, you have 70 individual authors who've contributed to 24 publications. Every line, every node is an author. Every line indicates an instance of co-authorship. And I've colored, in this case, to illustrate what types of groups are part of it, I've colored nodes according to institutional affiliations and their sizes according to degree centrality. Degree centrality means how many people somebody's connected to. So you see that you have the BGS, the British Geological Survey in the UK, in gray, and you see that big gray person in the middle up there to the left on the screen. Is obviously very well connected. The bigger they are, the more connections they have. And the BGS has been very instrumental in connecting people across other institutions in different countries, Cambridge University, pink, as well as the BRGM, French Mineralogical and Mining Institute. And then I just want to point out you have obviously a lot of peripheral actors as well that are not part of this main component, and they've mostly contributed to this literature through secondary data analysis. So they haven't been privy to the same kind of access that the people in the main component have. And that's obviously quite important when we think about how knowledge and access to knowledge is distributed within the scientific community if others are looking at those types of dynamics. So if we look at a slightly larger set of publications here, I've added something where I call reference editions by basically combing through and seeing whoever else comments on this type of information that I haven't picked up in the first search. We have 115 publications in this case, 197 individual authors, and I've colored nodes according to country affiliations to show you how international this is. In red we have Norway, dark blue the UK, pink France, black US, and dark gray the Netherlands. And I just want to show you a third version of this network that I've extended even more by collecting some individual reference lists. Again, these are people who have contributed to the Sleipner literature in one way or another, and some of them haven't all been privy to the same kind of access. But in this case, we have 215 publications, 296 individual authors that we see as the individual nodes, and I've colored them according to affiliation types, just so we can see that there's interaction actually across industry, university, research institutes, and even regulators contributed in some cases to this literature. The final iteration of the network I want to show you is the main component. So this is you see this, we've got the periphery out there with people who haven't had the same kind of access, and then you have the main component over there on the right. So zooming in on the main component, nodes have been sized according to the degree centrality. Again, this is the number of connections that a single author has, the number of individual instances of co-authorship, and I've colored nodes according to institutional affiliations, as in the first one. So we have, again, we see it's very clear that the British Geological Survey in yellow is extremely well connected, and there are many individuals that are fairly important in the network. We have in pink TNO, which is a Dutch research institute. In red, Stado. Stado is obviously in this network because they own the data, and they have their own research scientists. In dark blue, SINTEF, the Norwegian Research Institute, the largest in Scandinavia, in fact. In dark green, BRGM, the French Research Institute, and in teal, GEOS, the Danish Geological Survey. And so, what types of things have people looked at in this network, and why was the title of my presentation seismic? Well, here's another view of the network. It looks a bit odd compared to the others, the reason being that I tried to make it clear what people are well connected in the network. So the size of each node in this case is correlated with what's called betweenness centrality. So the other was degree centrality, that's the number of individual connections that you have in co-publications. In this case, betweenness centrality is how well somebody connects people across the entire network. So who is really important as a gatekeeper in transferred knowledge? Who does everyone else rely on? Who has local dependency? And I tried to make it clear by showing you that both size and higher vertical position is somebody who connects people's knowledge and transfers knowledge across the network through co-publication. So you see clearly that this individual Chadwick and this other person, Zandikowski-L'Oreal, they're extremely important relative to others. And they have looked, so there are very clear reasons for choosing to look at seismic because it's been so central to the evidence basis. Chadwick and others who are fairly well connected in this main component of the whole network have looked at 4D seismic monitoring. 4D means continuous seismic monitoring. I'll get to that in 5 minutes. Other issues that people looked at are geochemical simulation modeling, fluid flow simulation modeling, and reservoir geology. These are really the main 4 topics that are the evidence basis of long-term CO2 storage. Okay, so what do these people really believe is going on? Why do they believe that there's a network? Is it just something that we're making up when we choose to look at it as social scientists? Here's a quote from a well-connected, very prominent person in the network who's been part of CO2 storage for a very long time. This person said, "I think there's a fairly clear single community that I'm part of, and that we have a certain understanding of how these subsurface systems work, and we think we can inject carbon dioxide into them, and that will remain there effectively forever." I don't know of anyone who doesn't think that, actually. So this isn't to say that this is representative of every single person in the network, but it was a fairly it was a fairly common point to state among the geoscientists that I interviewed. So let's look at seismic images of Sleipner since seismic 4D seismic imaging, or in other words, continuous seismic imaging taking over 7 years, was such an important research topic in the seismic community. Normally, seismic imaging in hydrocarbon exploration is part of a much larger evidence basis. If we start at the top there quickly, where it says updating the reservoir model, to create a reservoir model first of the subsurface dynamics, use production history from oil and gas wells, use observations that are taken from instruments in these wells, and use a seismic base survey. That leads you to more easily create something called, to inform your reservoir modeling, essentially what's happening inside this geological reservoir, what dynamics are taking place. What's the flows? Then you can create a flow simulation model. Where's the oil and gas moving? Where's the brine, the salty water moving? And that can help you inform your seismic modeling. Again, we're talking about modeling here, and inform your production data. And finally, you can help that inform your seismic field data. How can modeling help inform field data? Well, because when you do these types of observations, like seismic observations, what you end up with is signal, noise, and distortion. Signal being the clear signal of what's actually taking place, noise being all the sorts of elements around you, that could be ships, it could be waves, all sorts of things that are distorting the information, essentially. So you need to take that distortion out. You need to be able to identify what is the signal and what is the noise, and if you can account for that 100%, it means that you know exactly what your distortion is, and essentially you don't have any distortion left. But if you can't account for that 100%, you end up with a lot of distortion in your imaging. And so you go around this model, which is my interpretation, really goes about the stuff of how it generally takes place in normal hydrocarbon exploration. This is important because in local well observations are essentially centerpiece of how to inform your seismic modeling and your seismic field data in normal hydrocarbon exploration. And that wasn't ever done in the Sleipner project, and it still isn't being done. What is being done is data from loads of well observations that are not local, but scattered all over the place, are being compounded to create essentially some sort of synthetic value. So that analogous data is there instead of local well observations. So we have about 2 minutes. Right, so I already explained that. So we'll move on to this image quickly. This is essentially what 4D seismic is. You have a seismic image, and then you do that again in consecutive years. And what I want to point out is this element over here that's called the velocity pushdown effect that becomes more noticeable as the years pass. That effect is essentially an unknown. It's unclear exactly what it is. It's something that just pops up in the images as the years go by. And it's been guessed by geoscientists that it is to do with the thickness of the accumulations of the CO2 that you can see there in blue and in red, the individual layers that distort the seismic signal. but it's not entirely certain. So the theory is that the increased compressibility from shale layers, that is very dense layers of rock inside the geology, show these surprisingly small gaseous accumulations of CO2 below the normal detectability limit that would otherwise not have been shown. And they are thought to improve the detection of future CO2 leakages, because you're able to look at CO2 essentially because of the shales. The shales change the seismic image totally. If you didn't have those shale layers, you wouldn't be able to see those tiny accumulations of the CO2. And so the theory goes that if the CO2 were to rise to the surface and migrate, you would be able to see that leakage, because by surprise, there are some very thin shale layers there. So I'm getting to the last two slides. The 2003 best practice manual that arose from this project concluded that it's exactly this major effect on the time-lapse seismic signal of relatively thin accumulations that's built our confidence that any major leakage into the overlying cap rock succession would have been detected. So they're saying, because we have those shales that are changing the compressibility and what we can see on the seismic from the CO2, we don't think that there is any leakage taking place. We think we'll be able to identify any leakage, in fact. Now that tone changed a lot in the 2008 version of it. It was a lot more cautious. And they said now that it's important to stress the need for caution in this type of analysis. Seismic detectability depends crucially on the nature of the CO2 accumulation. Small, thick accumulations in point strata will tend to be readily detectable. Conversely, distributed leakage fluxes through low permeability strata may be difficult to detect with conventional seismic techniques. Saturations are also uncertain. CO2 at low saturations can give comparable reflectivity, resulting in even lower detection thresholds. So suddenly the tone changed a lot over the years from seismic is great, we can see anything with it, to actually we need to take a step back. Seismic is just one tool, and I guess my point, if you want to take one point away from this, is that, because I need to get to the end now, let's skip this, let's go here. Is that ignorance is endemic to the subsurface. And that point probably needs to be more readily accepted within CCS circles still. If you talk to geoscientists who've done other things in hydrocarbon exploration, they'll be a little more open about it, as this quote reflects. I won't read it, you can just read it yourselves. And that really the robustness of information about environmental risks that might be associated with CO2 storage and leakage has been acquired in the presence of immense uncertainty and even ignorance in this case. And so when we talk about the robustness of it and whether it's appropriate instrumentation we use, that's really a socially mediated decision about adequate evidence that is only really supported very locally within this case study. And even if you go a little bit beyond where these techniques originate, there's strong points to dissuade people from the appropriateness of them, or at least the robustness of the evidence. So I think I've gone over time. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any questions?
Thanks. This is really interesting. So you seem to be making a connection between the power of the model, the source of the data, which is stato. So the source of the data, which is stato, was it? Yeah. The power of the model, which is acquired through continuous citation, and a sort of silencing of potential stories.
I wouldn't say a silencing as much as probably just like people not having paid attention or spoken so openly about those caveats as they have done in other places where similar instrumentation has been used.
Okay.
Silencing sort of implies a hegemony. I'm not saying that there's a direct hegemony going on.
Okay, I see what you're saying. So there was an effect maybe more than intention.
Yeah, it's more subtle than silencing, I would say, which is why I thought this was so interesting to go into to begin with. How is there this essentially a social construction of scientific knowledge around the appropriateness of certain techniques to look at the permanent storage of CO2.
So these are some of the things I didn't get onto that actually in recent years, research around permanent CO2 storage has changed to incorporate a lot more monitoring equipment, different types of monitoring equipment. I think the point about going around set oil and doing it at the same site is problematic. I think I like the idea and I would love to see that myself, but it's problematic because it's a producing natural gas field site still. And so when you begin to monitor for CO2 storage, what you're also going to see on those images is hydrocarbons. And that becomes a real issue for intellectual property rights, essentially, of that data, because it shows you how much is left. So they're really protective of their data. I mean, there's a lot more to this, obviously. There's a fairly big part of my PhD that I couldn't get into, but talking to geoscientists about access to data and reliability of what Stava presents them with, even, that's an interesting topic in itself. But generally, there's a lot of trust between the two camps.
Thanks.
You have a question?
Yes. Thank you for the presentation. One question is about the pacing of the change of tone. Because the Sleipner project, we looked, a PhD doctor looked in our department at the process, the political process of the emergence of EU CCS policy. And one turning point was the IPCC report. But before that, Sleipner was a major event. And in the discourse of many experts and in the demonstration, emerging demonstration policy, it was a reference saying, okay, now we can track CO2 underground, so we are entering the risk assessment era of CCS. My question is how backstaging some uncertainty was a statement in 2003, let's say. Backstaging, they were not lying, but they were just pushing on the front stage what they could say, and backstaging what they were not certain of.
I think the question is obviously extremely relevant to this. I address it in another, that particular question in a way. I sort of address it in a follow-on section. I obviously can't present for time limitations, but I think that it was extremely important. It was extremely important in structuring the way that the language of risk was presented in the IPCC report. Sleipner was, and other related research, but particularly Sleipner. And I think it was instrumental in creating a foundation for a perspective of risk rather than really talking more openly about indeterminacy and ignorance in those follow-on reports, in the methodology that was advocated by the special report, the IPCC special report. I couldn't say for sure. I mean, I think there's a little more subtlety going on, because I interviewed some of the geoscientists that were actually instrumental in formulating some of this language, and what their concern was, we need a risk-based assessment. We need to talk about risk, or we needed to, because we knew that it was going to be coupled with the ETS, the European emissions trading system, and if that was the case, we needed to move into language of accountancy. And
that was much later. I mean, the emergence of the idea of the new compressor. I think that's about.
No, I'm not. This isn't the new entrance to it. This is the ETS. This is the European Emissions Trading Scheme. But that was already on the table a lot longer. The people who were part of informing the IPCC were primarily the British Geological Survey, because they had started their own look at accountancy and how CO2 storage could be accounted for. And they were then drawn into the European debates because they were thought to have the requisite knowledge to inform how this should be done for the IPCC as well as later on the directive, CCS directive. So I have some understanding for why that language became a foundation for talking about uncertainties, how that risk-based language became a foundation for talking about uncertainties and what I would define as ignorance, really. And I don't think it was an attempt to present CCS, well, I don't know. I mean, we could always take a different perspective, but I tend to think that it was maybe an unintended consequence of trying to institute some strong accountancy measures rather than trying to hide some unknowns about CO2 storage. That's my take on it.
Okay, so we can have one more question from back there. Just can I ask you to be very concise on
Yeah, I'm sorry.
I can't resist saying that I'm surprised that it's geologists who become married to models. I thought it was footballers. I'm just intrigued about BGS, because BGS are a strange organisation because they're part independent government agency, but they also do a lot of consultancy work as well, and they have some sort of firewall down the organisation which is meant to keep those two parts somehow separate. So how do they orientate themselves around this? Do they play the consulting role, or do they play the independent authority role?
I don't know. I mean, that's a question I never really asked them, I suppose. Not directly. But if you look at their publications and the way they set up, I would say that they probably do both. I mean, I personally think, I mean, if you talk to people in these circles, they will say similar things, that the reason that BGS and other research institutes were drawn in so intimately with STS was to provide some legitimacy to the work that was going on, because they have their own research scientists that could easily do it. But to the outward world, it looks a hell of a lot more legitimate if you have the BGS and other people, you know, sort of providing a rubber stamp that this is good science.
Okay, so thank you, Benjamin. We'll proceed with Mariana.
Apologize for my bad spoken English. I will invite you now to participate in a little narrative towards the past. 19th century, near 30s, as we will see. In this time, there are a lot of big difference between countries and cities in Europe. The motive power of steam engine lies at the heart of scientific revolution, of the relationship between science and technology, of aesthetics, of production manners, and of lifestyles. It accompanies the emergence of new world visions, be they of a physical, social, or aesthetical nature. The motive power of the steam engine will be the main character of this little presentation. Thus, with some examples, we will find ourselves well into the 19th century in two highly contrasting cities, a changing Manchester and near and Berlin. However, we cannot leave out Paris, of course. Without Cardinal, would the world have changed as much as it has? Paris did not have the technological power that was present in England, but with Cardinal it did have the power of revolutionary thinking. Let us start with Paris, not directly by way of Carnot, but by using some ideas elaborated by philosopher Michel Serres. Serres wrote a very beautiful text after seeing an exhibition on English landscape paintings. He focuses on a painting by Garrard, which he interprets as a detailed premonition of a world that is on the verge of disappearing, the world of mechanics and human and animal musical power. With Turner, this premonition world is well illustrated in this painting, where it portrays the motive power of the steam engine. In a victorious fashion, it transmits Turner's enthusiasm for the new era. Michel Serres stated that Turner translates Carnot. Carnot writes his famous essay in 1824. But if you look at other paintings by Turner, we see that the translation of Carnot precedes Carnot himself. I like using this particular work by Turner as an example because it transmits an aesthetic change. This change is brought about by the presence of steam. In fact, in this work, there are two distinctive parts. In the first dominates a sharpness that has to do with the world of mechanics. Here is it. In the second, the margins dissolve caused by the heat, making it difficult to distinguish sky from earth. It is the passage of an aesthetics of imitation to an aesthetics of expression, as Delvin stated. Carnot translates Turner. The famous essay by Carnot was published in 1824. A great deal later would have major consequences for the way we view the physical world. It begins like this: personne ignore que la chaleur peut être la cause du mouvement, qu'elle possède même une grande puissance motrice. Les machines à vapeur aujourd'hui si répandues en sont une preuve parlante à tous les yeux. C'est à la chaleur que doivent être attribués les grands mouvements qui frappent nos regards sur la Terre. C'est à elle que sont dues les agitations de l'atmosphère, l'ascension des nuages, la chute des pluies et des autres météores, les courants d'eau qui sillonnent la surface du globe et dont l'homme est parvenu à employer pour son usage une faible partie. Enfin, les tremblements de terre, etc. L'étude de ces machines est du coup pour intérêt. Leur importance est immense. Leur emploi s'accroît tous les jours. Donc, ça sont les mots de Carnot. This initial part of the famous text gives us an idea of his enthusiasm about these machines. Through a process of abstract thinking, starting with some important facts, he formulated a universal idea about what governs the efficiency of these machines. The famous cycle of Carnot is difficult to comprehend, being very abstract in nature. It represents the beginning of thermodynamics. It connects two areas that until then have developed separately: movement and heat. Carnot, whose father was an hydraulic engineer, used the production of movement caused by water falling as a metaphor to describe the falling of heat. In Manchester, A little later, Jules stood at the forefront of a long debate with Kelvin. Jules defends an idea that disproved one of Carnot's ideas. This did not, however, diminish Carnot's enormous contribution to the development of thermodynamics. In fact, Carnot based his whole thinking on the idea of the conservation of heat. The universal value of his ideas is not affected by this wrong hypothesis. Besides, without this idea, if possible, would not have succeeded in constructing this theoretical edifice. With Jules, Meyer and Helmholtz, the concept of energy emerged in the 40s of 19th century. Carnot's essay shows his awareness that knowledge about the limits of the physical profit efficiency of the machine isn't everything and could even be of secondary importance. In his final phrase, Carnot appeals to something of great educational value, knowing how to distinguish between considerations that really matter at a particular moment and those that are mere accessories. This, as you can read here in this final fragment of Carnot's essay. So after Carnot's, there was a lot of developments in Paris, namely with the laboratory of Victor Reynolds. Carnot's essay is still being published and continues to be worthy of the attention of historians and philosophers of science and technology. The leap made by this great scientific mind continues to be an enigma. Carnot's work is the beginning of an important era in French science, which makes up for the lesser degree of technological development in the country. In this slide, I have a little fragment of a letter between Gilbert Renaud and Helmholtz. Helmholtz was one of the great contributors to the construction of the scientific concept of energy. He lived in Potsdam, near Berlin. His contribution results in the first mathematical equation on the conservation of energy. The idea expressed in this fragment shows us how important steam engine was. It becomes an analogy that allows for the understanding of a great many phenomena. It is no longer a question of mechanics alone. A cosmology focused on it is present in the text of different scientists, as Robert Meyer, another important scientist in the construction of the scientific energy concept. Sorry. On the other end, the steam, here also represented by Turner, promotes connections, reflections, and inventions that deserve to be highlighted. Here we see another painting by Turner in which steam occupies a place between the natural world and the world of artifice. This steam is between rain and speed. Rain from nature, speed from human invention. This idea of steam as lying in between nature and human invention is fundamental for the understanding of what steam represents during the 19th century. The two great principles of thermodynamics, energy and entropy, are born in relation with steam also. Steam I got some fragments of an anonymous writer from 1839 that has a very beautiful text where he tells a trip to Manchester and how, when we arrived to Manchester, how the life was different, because new rhythms began, were emerging, and common rhythms for meals, for everything in the life were beginning. So if I hate railways, of course, just so as the steam engine fellow drags you along up. Then I had to go everywhere at the same rate. So, but more important is this part where he is at Manchester, and he speaks about the constant work in upstream engines with all their dependencies, must contain many physical evils and bring about many a case of cruel suffering and loss of a limb, because the disasters were there. In a very different context, we can change to Berlin. Berlin is not yet an industrial city. So, I've chosen an article from Wise, not Unwise, Helen Wise, where they write a very beautiful text about the creation of a garden near Berlin, Peacock Garden, where steam engine was had a very important place. So the steam engine was also matter for some courses in philosophy, as this one for Schleiermacher about aesthetics. And life in Manchester contrasted with life in Berlin, Potsdam, following in this one, following the victory of Napoleon, Prussia turned toward England for its model of economic power and political freedom. And with that came also the landscape gardens, the English landscape gardens. Sorry. The English garden becomes the model for the development of some German gardens, in particular for the layout for the gardens of Peacock Island near Berlin. This project will be developed in the 30s. The steam engine will play a main role in the waterfalls, the fountains, the watering system, the sustenance of vegetable life. The steam engine will be visible and can be visited by all, contrary to the English landscapes where the artifices that maintain the scenery, the naturalistic scenery, were never supposed to be noticed. So, the very interesting thing is that we need the steam engine was visited by everyone that was interested in that, and it was playing a role, giving, so it is something that allows us to create a natural landscape where there were an unnatural landscape, because the landscape in this space was very arid. It was not considered a natural landscape. So for instance, this visitor says that so they didn't learn much about the machine, but this thing that with fire we can put water in immersion was something very important for here. There is some images. So we get a very beautiful vista, and it is a product of the artificial donc, and so I'm near the end. I'm bringing here Lauren Dustin because she was a guide for me in this, in bringing together some elements here. And this phrase from the introduction to Dustin's book, Things That Talk, from which the text of Wise was also taken, served to this a little for this journey to appreciate the mutability of steam engine by way of different varying appreciations. And fragmenting culture was our motive power. I will end with a little film it's very it doesn't go. It's about it's filmed at the
we're exactly on time now, so
I can, yes? Yes.
Which is it? No, it's very long.
No, it's not very long. I will show only some, but it's not there. I'm sorry. It was a little film about the hammer, a steam hammer, where we can see how people was working around the steam engines, and so I don't like it. I will finish. Thank you very much. So it was an essay to fragmenting culture with the steam engine visiting different places. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariana. Are there any questions? Yes.
Probably more of a quick comment. I was just thinking about how you know, sort of between the human and the nature, between the human and nature, and the artifice and artificially created elements and what's proper. I mean, it's fascinating that you know, many of those debates take place today with many of the topics that have probably been discussed here. People have been involved in public perception research, and you can see sort of groups aligning according to these cultural camps.
Yes, it's very interesting if you read this text from Wise, because there is a lot of discussion there. Because what are our representations of natural world? It's an artificial. It tries to show that it is our representations is from an artificial natural world, not the natural. So it's a discussion very interesting, because the steam engine here allows to construct, to build the natural, but with something that is very artificial.
Yeah, I had one comment which actually is a question at the same time. So, first one is with the steam engine. Actually, we can raise an important question that actually you didn't mention here, but it was a bit of side question, which is when innovation is, we can say that the innovation started.
Yes.
And with steam power, actually, what happened is there were a couple of trials to create the steam engine.
Yes.
But almost everybody agreed that the moment of the invention was with the Severi, right? Or Newcomen engine.
Yes, yes. What? Yes.
And why? Because it was the first time that actually they built the artifact, right? To pump up the water from the mine.
Yes, it's true.
So it was just that I was trying to find the moment when you mentioned the first service that actually these steam engines were providing. And the second comment was pretty much on the idea of using this case to distill some ideas for the innovation period. And it's very interesting in the future to look at the way that steam engine is used in Portugal and the way the technology was transferred.
Yes, it's very,
Pretty much.
Yes, I took only the moment where Carnot theorized about the steam engine. So it's a moment where technology precedes knowledge, scientific knowledge. And so the technology was there, but if Carnot didn't exist, perhaps all the things would be different. That's why I chose Carnot.
So I think there are no more questions. Thank you, Mariana.
Welcome, my name is Sjoerd Bakker from the Netherlands. I'm from Delft University. I have quite a pretentious title to my presentation, I thought. It's called Anatomy of Techno-Scientific Promise. But in practice, I don't think the subject is really difficult, and I hope you can bear with me for the following 15 to 20 minutes. Basically, my question is, from the variety of cars of the future that are being developed, green cars, low-emission cars, whatever you want to call them, why would we choose the one option and not the other to develop further? Why would we invest in the one option and not in the other? Or perhaps why not invest in all options? So there are competing technologies, competing visions, competing expectations as well between the underlying enabling technologies. And these are all by definition underperforming technologies. So none of these cars is really ready for today's market to compete on the consumer market. Yeah, I do expensive, but they just don't do what regular cars do today. I think for electric vehicles, and this is what my focus is on today, I think a lot of the expectations around electric vehicles build on expectations of further development of the batteries that are being used in these cars. And the question I have today in my talk is, how are these expectations constructed? And why would we actually want to believe these expectations, and effectively why would we believe this promise? Promises as it is put forward by its defendant. Briefly on the role of expectations and innovation. In general, we expect technology to improve over time. This is just the basic idea we all have, and this idea of the endless frontiers is very, very central to this. We can do anything we want, basically, through technology. A bit more into detail, expectations and specific technological options are inspiring to individuals. So individual developers, they're on a certain pathway because they have expectations of this pathway. But in a more sociological sense, expectations also guide collective action. So today, and I will show this later on, today there's a lot of talk and a lot of expectations about electric vehicles, and a lot of actors engage in these developments. Not necessarily because they believe themselves in these expectations, but they see that these expectations are all around and everybody's doing it, so not doing anything is hardly an option at that stage. And this also brings out the risk of heightened disappointment, because everybody's doing this, everybody's talking about it, and at some point expectations might become a bit inflated, and in the end, actual developments cannot keep up with these expectations, and disappointment will kick in, and people will withdraw their support again. This is the work on hypes and disappointment, but it's quite a long history already in the literature. Expectations may relate to the technology itself, so pure technological progress, but also to stakeholder behavior and to some contextual factors or landscape factors. I put in a picture of House of Cards because these expectations really are constructs of different arguments, and putting out one of these arguments, like battery expectations, may probably make the whole House of Cards collapse. Very well-known example, I think, Moore's Law in the electronics chip industry. There's this rule invented by Mr. Moore in the 1960s, and he once made his claim the density of computer chips will double every 2 years at a similar price level. This was not only a promise he just made once, but it was picked up by the industry, and it's sort of a guideline for their development. So they know that in 2 years' time they have to develop their chip capacity in order to keep up with their competition. So this promise turns into a requirement for individual companies. In early work, in my PhD thesis, I also looked at expectations and the competition between different technological options on the basis of storytelling and the basis of expectations. And came up with this sort of stylized representation of a perfect expectation. Consists basically of three elements. So there's recent progress in order to tell your decision makers, so to say, to tell them why your technological option is very promising. At first you need to show that you made progress in the recent past, because you can easily extrapolate this progress into the future, and you have a first argument to say, well, I need more funding, I need more support to continue along these lines. This will only get you to a certain point, and second, you need a path forward. So you need arguments to explain why your technology or why your option can be improved even further than you've done already. This is what we call the path forward. And I will, in the context of batteries, I will show some of these paths forward. And also very important is that you define an end goal that you can attain with your option. So it's not just progress into the void, progress infinity you need to define. You need to convince your decision makers that there's a specific end goal that needs to be attained and that you can actually attain with your option. And it's best if you can also argue that your competitors, so the dark gray line here, that your competitor is not able to meet those goals. This is what we studied in hydrogen storage solutions for hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, but I think it applies to batteries as well. Specific for electric vehicles, there's, like I said, there are a lot of collective expectations going on with electric vehicles, and some people claim it's a high. Expectations are already inflated. I'm not sure if this is really the case, but there are some indications that hype is going on. And these collective expectations really force a lot of actors to engage in this pathway. At the same time, there's also a lot of collective ambiguity that people have worries about electric vehicles. Worries that the range is not enough and will never be enough. the charging times are too long for consumers to really adopt electric vehicles on a large scale, and of course they're still too expensive. So a typical electric vehicle will be twice as expensive as a regular car today, and this is a difficult story for consumers. Even more so when you consider the fact that consumers have what they call a negative willingness to pay. So an electric vehicle is currently expensive. It used to be much cheaper than a regular car. Simply because it cannot really do what your car of today can do for you. So and again, much if not all depends on battery improvement. There are more expectations. The house of cards consists of more cars, and smart grids have to do with it, and other issues, but battery improvements really seem crucial. This is also what I drew from statements in the car industry, but also I did for another study. I did 40 to 50 interviews, and it all boils down to batteries. People claim that batteries need to improve, and everybody seems to agree that batteries will improve. Some quotes. The one below from Elon Musk, the CEO of Tesla, which is one of the challengers in the automotive industry, solely focusing on electric vehicles. He makes his reference to Moore's law, and he says there's an 8% annual improvement in batteries consistently over the last so many years, and this is likely to hold in the future as well. So batteries are crucial, and they are widely expected to improve, but why is the question. Simply speaking of battery performance, it's easier said than done. There are a lot of criteria that apply to batteries for EV traction. First of all, there's the cost aspect, but also there's the capacity of the battery, so how much energy can you actually put in the battery, how much power can you get out of the battery and put in the battery in a limited time space. How often can you charge it and discharge it, how long does it take to charge it, are they safe or not, and is there enough raw material out there, can you actually recycle these batteries in a sustainable way. Priorities between these criteria vary per application, and often there are trade-offs between different characteristics and criteria. So you can get a very high capacity battery, but it will be costly, and you can get a cheap battery with low capacity. These trade-offs are all around. Very briefly on my methodology, I know it's kind of a dirty word in STS circles. I had two articles from an online source and a print source. I searched them from 2009 to 2013. Search for lithium ion and coded the various statements on the different aspects in this product. First of all, looking at the first bit of performance about recent progress, there are a lot of graphs that actually show that lithium-ion batteries have progressed in the recent past. And you could extrapolate these, but it's not really easy, also because there are so many different versions of lithium-ion batteries, and there are so many different characteristics. Also, when you look at electric vehicles from the past, there's a clear evolution from a very lumpy slow car to the sports car, which is already outdated by the way. But one of the stories with lithium-ion is that they were developed in laptop batteries and smartphones, and they've made a step change. They're a step change better than lead-acid batteries, for instance, that were used in the older electric vehicle models. Part of the lithium-ion story, the electric vehicle story now, is that lithium-ion batteries have made a breakthrough in performance, and now they're good enough for electric vehicles. But this was a story that was used 5 to 6 years ago. And then the optimists claim electric vehicles are possible, we can use them. Already a couple of years later, today we realize that electric vehicles are still not good enough. So this lithium-ion story as it was is not good enough anymore. So we need to find arguments to say that they will be better and they will be cheaper in the future. The easiest path forward is actually found in manufacturing. It's basic scale effects, economies of scale, bigger factories, more efficient factories, more raw material mining, and lithium is quite rare still. New mining facilities are being constructed, and this will set to bring down the cost of lithium. This is all part of the story. Standardization of the battery packs may help as well. some consultancies have made quantified promises about scale effects. So, for instance, a 65% cost reduction towards 2020 by the Boston Consultancy Group is a strong argument, and it supports this Moore's Law idea that there is a steady, predictable progress in terms of cost reductions. Also, Roland Berger has made some statements about increasing capacity in the near future. A next step is actually relates to the idea that lithium-ion batteries as they're used today, and that current chemistries are finite in terms of the progress that can be made. And there's a clear idea of what the theoretical limit of these batteries is. So we need to look further beyond current chemistries, and you can tweak with different elements in these batteries. So there's the anode, the cathode, and the electrolyte in between. I will not bother you with technical details because I don't know them myself as well either. But basically, on the three elements, the anode is usually a graphite today, which is cheap, but it's not able to store a lot of electrons. So people are looking for silicon and titanium anodes to increase capacity. On the cathode side, cobalt oxide is used. It's very efficient, but it's mined from the unstable regions like the Congo in Africa. So alternatives are necessary as well. If you look at lithium, iron phosphate, manganese, and sulfur for this. And for the electrolyte, these are complex salts, inorganic solvents. These organic solvents are flammable, and this is the reason why sometimes accidents happen with lithium-ion batteries. So people are looking for solid-state batteries to increase the safety of these batteries. Not so much making them cheaper or get to higher levels of capacity, but this is more for safety. And beyond these sophisticated paths forward, there are also more generic sources of hope, as I call them. This is what I said, engineering towards theoretical potential. So you know that these chemistries have a theoretical potential, and all you need to do is get them together. People refer to this theoretical potential quite often. It's just a matter of engineering towards this goal. There's talk of nanotech, there's talk of NASA getting involved, also helping this story of batteries. Finally, after we've done work with manufacturing, after we learn chemistry, lithium-ion batteries, and tweak the current principles of lithium-ion batteries, there's also a new generation of batteries. And these are spearheaded by the so-called lithium-air batteries. They're questionable in terms of how often they can be charged and discharged. In the lab, it only goes 10 times or so that's really little. But there's a potential of 5 to 10 times higher energy density. So this is one of the things that's hovering above this electric vehicle market. We all know the limitations of lithium-ion batteries, but out there is this lithium-air battery. This is going to be on the market in 10 years, so we only need to wait 10 years and then 10 years still. Now, other options as well, like lithium-sulfur and zinc-air batteries. Even reinventing the old lead-acid battery. There may be great promise in this very old, trustworthy battery as well. However, like I said, it's at least 10 years away, and it will certainly not be commercial before 10 years time. When coming to this end goal, which is also part of this promise, there's a clear distinction between the pragmatists. So people say, well, consumers, they need a car that can take 300 kilometers and it needs to be affordable. And this is kind of a high goal, but still it's pretty much attainable, as I gather. And it's quite modest in a way. And on the other side is Toyota. They have set this goal internally, and they call this the Sakichi battery. This is the battery that has a higher energy density than gasoline has today. And this is like 100 times the capacity of today's lithium-ion battery. So this is a really idealistic goal. And if this is the battery they're looking for, they're never going to find it probably, so then they have a problem in living up to their plans. Now, I don't really know why they have this goal. Perhaps it's a Japanese thing to set the bar high. But yeah, if you want to have an actual promise kind of attainable, you better be pragmatist. Coming to the end. Conclusions as I saw them, as I dissected them. They're not as smooth as the ideas, the curve I showed in the beginning. You can see roughly three generations. So the first is the Sleipner curve, but it has a defined end to it. So these are theoretical limitations. They're not getting us to the goal that is set by many actors in the field. Then there's the second curve of options that are not really performing anywhere beyond the laboratory today or only on a very small scale. And they will come into the market and they will make further progress. So let's get questioned, and you can question on which performance criteria they actually will perform very, very well. So then there's this third generation spearheaded by the lithium air batteries, which are even more speculative, which are more uncertain. But they wait, or at least they can be used to make this claim we're going to reach this numbers. Perhaps at some day. Nobody will ever use, nobody will ever quantify the timeline attaining the end goal. So we're going to make it, but we don't know when to. Yeah, so what I did at first, I listened to a lot of people, and they had these fake ideas about the lithium-ion promise. And they're all sure that lithium-ion batteries will improve, that they will improve enough and soon enough in order to satisfy consumers. But looking deeper into these expectations, you kind of get more uncertain. So this really resonates with the certainty trough of McKenzie, which in the middle users, or I think in this case policymakers and other decision makers, also within car companies, I'm afraid, they're really certain that batteries will improve. But the more you move towards the actual developers, the actual experts, you become more and more uncertain of what can be achieved. And I'm afraid that this is speculative on my part, but this is an indication to me that there's some sort of hype going on. That a lot of decision makers expect too much of battery improvements, and they invest a lot today in getting electric vehicles on the road, expecting that there will be, in 2, 3, 4 years' time, there will be good enough to live on without subsidies, for instance. When you look through the eyes of the experts, and you look at these battery promises, you'll find that uncertainty is much higher. There's a lot of complications in these promises. So there's a serious risk that we end up with a phase of disappointment in 2 to 3 years' time when subsidies effectively run out and vehicles are still too expensive for regular consumers. I know this is speculative, but this is one of my worries. Coming to the final slide, institutions for practitioners, and not just your own system. I think we have to rely on existing battery technologies, so the lithium-ion batteries that will become cheaper but not spectacularly fast. So you need to count on these high-priced electric vehicles still. If you want to keep on supporting these in the market, you need high levels of subsidies, which are often about 50 to 100% of the manufacturing costs of these vehicles. And the question is how long can policymakers, how long can they keep up with these subsidies? Yes, there are new batteries, but they're still in the lab phase. And before they will bring any step change improvements in price and performance, so not one of the two, but in both, it will take at least 10 years. And there's this value of death will remain there for 10 years probably. And this is how STS I know to draw this conclusion to. It's a challenge to maintain the current momentum around electric vehicles, knowing that these electric vehicles will not develop at the speed at which they are expected to improve. So therefore my conclusion for practitioners is try to let go of this broad consumer market and focus on electric vehicle applications that make sense to do. So applications where cars can be a bit more expensive because they're used fairly intensively, for instance. Instead of focusing on these huge consumer markets where people simply expect to be able to buy a car at current cost and with current performance levels. And electric vehicles will not do this in 10 years and probably not even in 15 or 20 years. So these were my conclusions. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Any questions?
And what is, I think, one of the kind of key barriers, or what I remember from that time, is the question of how to redefine what's the criteria for success. And Tesla is really interesting now, as they are trying a really different business model. And is it possible that they are successful in terms of redefining that they no longer want to compete primarily on the basis of price performance ratio or the range what the vehicle can where a vehicle can get with a similar battery, but more like trying to produce the kind of coolest car than otherwise and trying to focus on a market segment what do not really care about the price.
No, I agree that a company like Tesla is very interesting in this respect. They're given for the stop segment where people can actually pay a bit more for electric, although these cars are more or less in the same price range as their competitors from BMW and Mercedes. I think this fits my conclusions also because Renault's Twizy, I'm not sure if you noticed, it's a very small car. You can't go a long way with it. It's really useful for niche applications. So people just want a second car in the family only to go shopping, for instance. So yes, these cars, these business models are really interesting. What I'm talking about here is big companies going for mass market vehicles, and I'm not sure they can work in the free consumer market in the coming 10 years. This company like Tesla is super interesting. And I think they're probably doing a good job within a very specific segment. I'm not sure if they can be a model for the entire car industry that has to focus on mass markets as well, simply because they're so big.
First of all, I'll try to be very short. So I will enjoy your presentation. It's very interesting, and it's also interesting to see how electric vehicles are being used as a good example of how social science can help technology to develop. My questions are directly. So, what is the difference between the methodology actually put here forward with this 3 steps? Remember pages. Recent progress, that forward, and backpassing. So I would like to know more about that. You let me know this. And another question is, what about the competition with other technologies? For instance, one with a new technology. Now that we're saying that the batteries and the storage, the energy storage is really a hurdle, it's really a problem. And nowadays there are other types of technology. I think it's induction, right? Induction. So, what if this new ways of conceiving the electric car in the future is going to displace the electric vehicle idea, and how can you mobilize it or another way of thinking is, what if conventional technology, just like the ICE car, actually can bring down consumption to 1 liter. Now we have 1 liter Volkswagen that costs 100,000 euros. But what if in the near future this car comes down to probably 20,000 and it becomes available to everybody? What would be the consequences in terms of the pathway to electric vehicle? And I would stop.
To pick up on the last point, yes, there are other options and they're developing very fast. And in terms of the competition between different options, looking back, there's always been phases of electric and hydrogen and electric and hydrogen. Yeah, you tend to alternate historically, and it's likely to happen again. And I think that this point in electric vehicle developments or battery developments will open up a gap for new options. and it probably will have induction technologies for instance. So you can, if people start recognizing that electric vehicles will never be a one-on-one substitute of regular cars, they will start looking for other alternatives. And hydrogen is coming up now in a lot of discussions already. So yes, disappointments in one option will kind of create an opening for other options. That's how I look at it.
And how your methodology relates to backcasting?
Yeah, as I understand, backcasting is setting a long-term target and looking how you can get there, right? I think what I did looks a bit too much like basic forecasting. So asking a lot of experts, what do you expect of this technology? They will tell you probably the same story. But I tried to take a different perspective and try to look at the stories that are being told and try to dissect this kind of black box idea that batteries will perform better in the future. So I think methodologically doesn't really differ so much. From basic forecasting, I think it's a bit different. It's also probably taking into account a bit more factors than basic technological forecasting exercise would be.
So thank you very much. For the presentation, not only because my dad just died 2 minutes ago and important to the next generation, but I'm also doing research on like interpretations and images in the area of vehicle-to-grid systems. So this is very similar to what we're doing about the fuel cell and the battery technology now. And after everything I've read about this and after the presentation, I'm still a little bit puzzled about like one phenomenon that is consistent throughout all these expectation hype cycles. On the one hand, the technology is ever changing in terms of innovation. It's getting always better. It's never constant. But what is constant is the social side. It's like the expectations towards the actual users, the institutions, and how these technologies are actually going to be used in society. And in a way, you could say GM had with the EV1 at the end of the 90s a perfectly fine working electric car that was affordable and that you actually use and liked. And this didn't work out. And now we still have like so many. This is like something we pointed out towards the end of the presentation. There's so many places where electric cars can be used with the existing technology, but still pretty much across the board, all engineers, policymakers, everybody is talking about like the next generation of batteries, about the range expander, all these tech fixes, and I mean this was more of commentary, but why is that? To turn it into a question, I mean.
Yes, it relates to this other question as well. I think, and this is what all these consumer studies. This is what they do. They ask people, what do you want from the car? They will tell you, I want from my new car, I want the same as my old car, maybe cheaper. So it's difficult to grasp.
There's also different studies, by the way, who show that people can adopt to changing technologies.
Yeah. But what I think is interesting, in another study we looked at what different car companies do, and you see that the big car manufacturers all go for the mass market model, which I think is not super clever. Okay? This is what they do. They do it for their own purposes. But all new startups, like Tesla, but also a lot of other companies, they aim for these other types of cars, and other types of use as well. So if you want to make profit today, you've got to focus on these small niches or different uses of cars.
So you have to
Yes,
it is short.
With regards to your work, do you have any with regards to height? If you're talking about the aluminium batteries, I was wondering if you have any extrapolation between your work and this new technology that people are talking about. Not yet.
Okay, so thank you very much.
So, next 15-20 minutes, we're talking from this project, Solar Energy for Future Society. This is a project that's a collaboration between Durham University and the University of Sheffield in the UK. It's focusing on, empirically, it's focusing on the next generation of photovoltaics, and that's where we started. Funded by the UK's Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council. However, they didn't really fund us to look at photovoltaics. That was in our proposal for the project. So they really funded us first of all because we promised to be interdisciplinary. So this project's very much physics,
geography, architecture, to some extent also I explored engineering. And we've talked quite a lot about that, certainly less than the discussion this morning, but we're not going to do that. We're going to talk instead about the other dimension of what we promised to do, and that was to do not only interdisciplinary science around next-generation technology, but to do participatory science, the engaging with what we frame at the start, at least, as future users of next-generation PV technology, solar electric technology, which doesn't exist yet, except at the light stage. So what we're talking about is kind of our experience of trying to do this as a project. I mean, that's essentially a story of the opening of what we're terming the participation laboratory, like this before that. So what we're going to do between us is, first of all, set up stalls for engaging with all sorts of different forms of expertise well upstream from the stabilization of technology. It's not something I'm sure we're going to have to try hard to convince everyone of that. From there, setting up, first of all, Brian Wynn's concept of invited participation is basically then outlining this idea of participation as one experiment. Essentially arguments following Wagner that most modes of participation on technology like this tend to decontextualize the process of participation. It's quite slow at the time. So that gives the framing then for narrating what we've done within our project, which has essentially been trying to destabilize solar technology. Solar technology exists now as something very stable, very accepted. We have to try and destabilize this in order to get people to think about possible futures. But where that has led us, and essentially in contesting where we started, we recognize now something of participation. And finishing up with conclusions on really what it means. So thinking about how we can locate deliberation, participation of future technologies within the assemblages of a place and of everyday life. The locations in which, of course, technologies have to end up being employed.
Alright, thanks a lot. So I'm just going to talk quickly through a little bit of the literature that Matt has alluded to, and I'll go straight to the ethnographic meet, which is ongoing because the project still has a year and a half in its life, so we're still very much in the thick of it. Yeah, we don't have answers, but we have some inputs. Engaging in the upstream, as Matt was saying, upstream, what this project is doing, or where it started from, was the idea of engaging in technologies before they become stabilized. So this, I'm sure this is all very well known to all of you, so I'll just go through this very quickly. A very classic STS idea that social norms, expectations, practices are already embodied in technologies when they reach us, and then there is this double act when the technology is coupled with the society inside, coupled with technology. Due to scientific and technological controversies, really over the last 30 years, there has been a drive towards engaging publics in the development of technologies before this certain lock-in of expectations, norms, etc. takes place. This has been called the engagement in the upstream. Like Nathan here says that the upstream engagement doesn't assume that the publics know better than the scientists what should be done, but rather that upstream engagement is more about rendering scientific cultures more self-aware of their own taken for granted expectations, visions, and imaginations of the ultimate ends of knowledge, and rendering these more articulated and thus more socially accountable and resilient. So this is sort of where we started from. And the history of this upstream engagement obviously is around controversies, it's around genetically modified organisms, it's around nuclear power, and more recently it's around nanotechnology and geoengineering, which are truly upstream technologies in that they don't exist yet. The methodology that has come with upstream participation has been described by Wine and others as invited participation. So it is generally, so the public is selected to be representative of the public of a particular nation, for example, or a particular place. This public is then lifted and invited to participate in events which are organized by public or private authorities. Through discourse, through deliberative methods, such as citizen panels and focus groups, etc., the views of this public are elicited and kind of constructed and pulled together. And Mawyin and others have taken quite a critical approach to invited participation, showing that it has a lot of similarities with classic laboratory methods used in normative science, in that social facts are constructed through what Lauren calls experimentation with technologies of democracy. So as I said, this could be through citizen panels or public debates with kind of organized top-down events. It often involves those kind of methods often involve elicitation experts, which tend to be social scientists, who are seen as the people. They know what to do with people, so some of them. And after the pooling together of these opinions and fears and normative standpoints of this public, these social facts are constructed and then communicated in authoritative ways. They may become part of policy, they may become part of normative standpoints of institutions, etc. So we have power, we have ownership, we have authority and claims to neutrality that come with this sort of method. And Buckner, in a really interesting paper in which he analyzed citizen panels around nanotechnology, concluded that this sort of participation really does have a lot of resemblance with laboratory methods, and he calls it participation as a lab experiment. And he says that this lab participation is characterized mainly by its decontextualization, that is, these deliberation experiments are carried out in a contained environment and bear practically no relation to the world outside. So this is very attractive as an idea. So, unfortunately, I only read Buckner recently, and when we started this method, this project, in retrospect, we can say that we were firmly in the laboratory context. So what happened, as Matt was saying, our initial remit was to be interdisciplinary, it was to be participatory, it was also to work with publics which were described in our funding bill, I believe, as at the bottom of the pyramid. That was the goal. And so we focused on photovoltaics and social housing, which are in itself a very interesting phenomenon in the UK at the moment. We're going to focus on household level, and our recruitment of participants was going to proceed through technology. In retrospect, very naively, we thought that technology is interesting, which it isn't, especially when it's just solar panels. So as you can see from our early sort of marketing materials, if you just look at the images there, solar panels and kind of aspirational, upstream, lab-based technologies, the future of solar PV, and all our hype was around solar PV is really interesting. Let's talk about it. Needless to say, that didn't go down well at all. We failed to interest participants in this project, in spite of wearing out shoe leather, in spite of organizing events. There was just no traction. The technology didn't stick. It was not relevant. And unfortunately, we were self-reflexive enough to learn from that, to see that there was something wrong, that something was just not gelling. And serendipitously, as it tends to happen, our colleague from architecture was doing work in a little town, which we call Steel Vale, and her work gave us an opportunity to radically rethink our methodology, to try kind of something different, start again with a clean slate, so to speak. Not to say that, again, the initial trials were very successful, but there was something different. So what we did, we organized an exhibition around energy futures of Steel Vale and the role that technologies, PV technologies particularly, could play in these energy futures. So we're already coming round to a rather different perspective, focusing much more on practice, on the future, on the scenario kind of thinking. And this exhibition, which the main exhibit was this model of the valley as it could be in 2050, was quite successful. We had about 90 visitors, and some of them were very local indeed, pulling off over wind turbines, for example, and put up on the hillside. So there was something was going on, which was positive. And from this exhibition, we pulled kind of the most important themes, not only around solar technologies, but also others. And we organized a workshop, which was again quite structured. It had about 35 self-selecting participants, which is significant because it means that something was working. We were creating an interest, we were creating a public. But it was a very structured event. It was structured around future scenarios, which we wrote. It went well as a deliberative exercise, in that it did what deliberative exercises tend to do, which is elicit opinions about the future, activate fears, activate hopes. People basically were telling us what they would wish for or what they wouldn't like, etc., which is important data in its own right, but it wasn't what we wanted, because our remit was the co-production. We wanted to bring the public together with the scientific thinking on PV technologies and make something happen in this hybrid space between science and the public. In this event, the scientists, even when you look at the images, not this one but other, even spatially, the distance between the scientists and the public was huge, and we were failing in to bring together this technology as something that matters, rather than that matters kind of in the lived experience. And these are just some characteristic quotes from this event. So typically the conversations around the future of the energy systems saw technology as independent of everyday realities, and also it focused on technological progress. So when we were asking people to imagine what PV could do, photovoltaics could do in the future for them, for their valley, for their community, there was a sense of unavoidability and also uncertainty. So, if it continues the same way as it has done, somebody said, in the last 40 years, I mean, what is to stop them having mirrors in the sky and sending 24-hour sunshine down to a big solar panel unit? It's a possible scenario. And somebody else said, in the next 50 years, something revolutionary may happen. And it just swings the whole thing back to a different scenario. So because this technological progress was seen as both unavoidable and unpredictable, our participants saw this as completely futile, trying to engage with the future, which they saw themselves as having no control over. So the lived experience again failed to talk to the technology, and the technology failed to talk to the lived experience. And this kind of showed us that the deliberative context was really not enough. Just talking about stuff was not enough to create a co-production of knowledge. We were still just extracting from participants. We were not giving anything back. Which brought us to a crisis in the project, and we organized another workshop 3 months later, in which we just sat people around in a circle and said, look, what do you want to talk about? Which was quite a departure for us. We abandoned the assumptions that we knew what the topic should be. We set some ground rules. We wanted to talk about photovoltaic technology. We wanted to talk about the future of energy generation. But these were just fences, and within it there was a field, and we could just do what we wanted on it. And that's quite a nice cliffhanger, so I'll pass it on.
So we have a lot of time.
Yeah. So what we've ended up with is has this kind of emergence, which we recognise something of a luxury. We have quite a long period of funding for this to work. But what emerged has been this process of bi-monthly workshops. We've had what, half a dozen now? And we see that, We see it very much as a process of exchange. And obviously it's a continuum and there's never sort of equal power and there's never a perfect speed relation. But it feels like there's this process of joint deliberation and learning, where the academics are bringing along certain kinds of things, like the stuff, like the model forms of knowledge and material forms, and workbooks, moving on to visual representation. It's one of the advantages of working with architects, they can draw. So it has some interesting representations to communicate back to the participants outside of the academy. On the other hand, people from Steelwell bring all kinds of expertise, of course, of their own in terms of the past, the industrial heritage of the place, in terms of contemporary political conflict, very much affected by controversy over a local community centre. And perhaps most important is attachment to the place that they all share. Steelwell. So what emerged through this process of workshops was a series of projects that were co-produced. They came from the people who were working with, ways into doing something participatory, something action-oriented, without necessarily promises of material change, but action-oriented in terms of changes people would like to see to this community. So around transport, I'm thinking about how the global sleep PV could be incorporated into transport, in terms of local food initiatives, about how PV could be incorporated with other energy sources, including the waste heat from the local steel plant, to generate local food. Education, and trying to use the projects that are going on otherwise to work with local schools. As Anna mentioned earlier in the day, of projects trying to renovate community buildings, more energy efficient, and finally, a project mapping out the potential for renewable energy generation and debalancing within the local environment. So through these processes, what we do generate isn't an invited public. There was an invitation, there was an open invitation, it's a situated public. It's taking place in the community. And community buildings are part of the discussion. It's very much a project that is in place to drop this. It's self-assembling, as I said, and to some extent self-selection. A public with this attachment to place. And what characterizes this in a way is a profound openness, which brings its frustrations on both sides. Quite often have participants who asked for more direction from the academics, as Spengler's put certain knowledge claims and practices of those researching knowledge controversies are somehow put at risk, stake in the controversy alongside those people affected by it, with whom they collaborate. So, a sense of the unsettling of the academic process. But through this quite open process and kind of stepping back, often having difficulty keeping photovoltaics even as part of the conversation, recognizing how these technologies have to be integrated into these assemblages of everyday life in the place, of the politics of the place, people's attachments to landscape and to the history of the place, into the practices of everyday life into which technologies have to become integrated in some way, into the power relations, people, the same sort of walkers, how laden these kinds of discussions are. And into the geography of the place. There's been a lot of detail mentions of geography today. So in the end, it is a frustrating process often. Sometimes it feels like it's been generating frustrations for ourselves and for our participants. But it's been productive. And it's been a real luxury to be able to do this with kind of a long period of funding. So rather than disrupting, rather than just frustrating, we see these influences and disruptions of experience as enriching both for our learning as academics and the learning of our participants. Through these workshops, we're all given an opportunity to ask questions of each other, to kind of act as different forms of reality check for each other. In this zone where the laboratories or technologies in development meets the reality, the zone where technology of
try to put PV before the problem, because if you take Dewey's idea about the topic created by a problem, I'd like to ask you, what was the problem then for people with PV, you know?
Yes, I answer that. I mean, there wasn't a problem. It's part of the difficulty of assembling public around PV. Obviously, most participation within technology has been about technologies that aren't controversial, that people have fears about, that there are risks attached to. Of course, some people object to PV, but compared to all other energy production technologies, it's probably the most uncontested. It's quite inoffensive, visually not very striking. It's modular, so it can be on small scale. So part of the reasons we've had to keep sort of stepping back and look for new ways of innovating with methods is that it hasn't been easy to gather public because there isn't a problem.
So just to continue that, what we have, I mean, a controversy opens the technology up naturally because it becomes problematic. What we have had to do is find other ways of opening a technology, opening it without controversy, without a problem. And this has been through this experimentation with different ways that the technology can fit into existing practices on a community level. And sometimes technology falls straight off, it doesn't stick. And sometimes it sticks, and sometimes it's kind of in the middle and we have to work at it. And this is where the learning is happening, if you want. So it's not easy.
Thank you for the presentation. I thought it was very interesting to see like how your questioning also evolved with the project. One thing I was wondering about was this idea of participation as some kind of a laboratory or something like democratic laboratory work. Conflicts, of course, and something that with the dynamics that take on with the, between the consultation process itself and the wider environment. So the process in which wider we consult, so the political environment, how the consultation process is embedded in it, what type of actors, of course, do you have to engage actors. Talking about these, or thinking about dual dynamics, for example, especially with the notion that was introduced by Mari's vision. In the PV and in your case, at the end, you didn't talk much about that. Is that because it didn't come in, or is it because for example, talking about solar futures or PV futures in Great Britain, I would think what is about the nuclear controversy, we didn't do like bringing why do you ask about EVs when our government do nuclear plants, or so how did this the outside controversy or your work?
Okay, I'll start this time. Yes, absolutely. Both national level and local level controversies always take precedence. There is no question of that they dominate the debate. And this is the challenge of trying to discuss a technology which is not controversial. However,
how's your role and the role of the experiment then seen in this context? That was my question. Of course, things come in, but what is what are roles that people give you? What do they think of? Why do you do this?
Yeah. Part of the learning of the project is actually how the project number of follows everyone around us. So these functional participants about what they expect of us, and then frankly completely puzzled about. We failed to fulfill their expectations of what academics, what scientists would do initially. And the group, obviously the group has changed over time, it's reduced as well. And they've come to an accommodation with us and kind of understand us in that collaborative way. But yeah, I mean, in terms of the controversies that are around it, that's absolutely what people came to the table with, and that's why we end up with the PhD is we're continuously trying to find ways of getting the PhD to stick, because that was our initial interest, but it slips because of people's understanding of the alternative technologies, because of local projects. Because in terms of the laboratory, to some extent, it's a metaphor, but at the same time, what the laboratory experiment doesn't also have its social context or its politics, and its unpredictability. So, if a course with it being social, it's more difficult to control than it often is in a physics laboratory, perhaps. But you have these same characteristics of decontextualization and control.
So you could imagine that if the nanotechnology debate was taking place in a similar format, the questions they would encounter would be very similar because people don't know much about nanotechnology. So the questions would be, why are we talking about this? Our leisure centre is being closed, we should be generating electricity out of water, somebody's trying to put a wind turbine in my field or next to my farm. So this is a real challenge for this very normative idea in science and technology studies of democratic participation in technology. But there is a difficulty in opening the issues up and making them relevant. There is this resistance, which is only natural because the publics they're not malleable, they're not clean slates, they're not just talking heads that will interact with you because you wish so. You have to create an environment to enable it, and it has to be tailored to the local interests, or otherwise it just slips away. So that's kind of, I guess that's the message that we're trying to get across.
I think there was a question back there.
Yes, it's just a reaction to the earlier discussion about publics forming around problems. I think publics form around opportunities as well. I think it's not just problems. I think that notion that publics form around problems comes from the fact that a lot of research is focused on problems and is focused on the processes through which publics form around things that are problems. But I think there are all sorts of opportunities that publics actively organise and become around as well. And in a way, some of what you were sort of getting was more about some of the opportunities that there were in technology rather than the problems of it. So that's perhaps another way of thinking about it.
Yeah, that's right. And that's kind of where the project started to get its dynamic. So it wasn't about opportunities. Although the project hasn't got enough funding to make things happen materially, so part of our collaboration is helping the community find funding sources to realise opportunities.
But I think that's a really interesting point because we have an interesting contrast in this study in that during our research there was a self-gathering public which gathered around this the closure of this leisure centre, and this was self-forming, democratic and very wide public. It was a third of the inhabitants of the place, so it was staggering, and there are like 14,000 people there. And this public has been very successful in working towards its goal, which is keeping the leisure centre open. But it's a very different public to one which forms around the opportunities that may be afforded by photovoltaic technology, because it's a public of, I'm very fresh in my thinking about it, so to speak. But it links to the issues of community energy and community energy policy in Britain, and what kind of groups come forward undemocratically to represent spatial and social groups for the future, through this promise of doing something, and they're not representative. So I'll just end there.
Representative banging.
I think we can finish. Thank you.
Thank you.